Hello everyone, and welcome to The Current, the North Central Region Water Network's Speed Networking webinar series. The Current is an extension-led collaboration, or the network is an extension-led collaboration among land-grant universities in 12 Midwestern states, working to build capacity for effective decision-making on water-related issues. The purpose of The Current is to increase access to university extension programming and research that can strengthen water resource management across the Midwest. My name is Rebecca Power, and I'm Director of the North Central Region Water Network. I will be your moderator for today. As a reminder, all the webinars are recorded and archived on the North Central Region Water Network website at northcentralwater.org, and they are also available at learn.eextension.org. And there are currently 17 archived webinars there, so there's a lot of great information that you can go to even if you weren't able to attend the webinars in real time. Our topic today is developing capacity for local watershed management, and our standard format is 3 10-minute segments with questions and discussions at the end. We've got a couple of different presenters in each segment this time, so maybe a little bit longer than 10 minutes. We'll see how this goes. For participants, please submit your questions for presenters via the chat box. That chat box is in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or should be. And we'll have as I said, there will be a dedicated question and answer session following the last presentation. So with no further ado, first I want to show you a cool cool water-related phenomenon that we had here on the UW-Madison campus. And you can see this cloud here is a funky rainbow cloud that I've never seen before, but you'll see it there in the middle of the screen. So we all went out to see it before the webinar and thought we would share it with you quickly before our presentations start. Okay, so today's presentations, Baird and Joe Bonnell from The Ohio State University will be talking about professional development needs of water resource managers and core competencies for water resource managers. Lois Wolfson from Michigan State University and James Frankenberger from Purdue will be talking about perspectives from 4 Watershed Academy programs on training water resource professionals. And Lewandowski from the University of Minnesota will be talking about professional training methods and the role of online learning. Baird will be our first speaker, and she's a program director in the School of Environment and Natural Resources and directs the Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist Program. All of the presenters' contact information is given several times during the course of the presentation, and we'll also provide that for you at the end. So with that said, Anne, take it away. Oh, I'm sorry. I also need to introduce Joe Bonnell, who's also talking during this segment, and he is the Program Director for Water Resource Management in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. He also directs the Ohio Watershed Academy and the Ohio Watershed Network. Okay, so Joe and Ann, go ahead.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is Joe. I'm actually going to kick off our segment of the presentation. So good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be with you. I am Joe Bonnell at the School of Environment and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. And I'm going to be, Ann and I are going to be kicking off the webinar to talking about how we identify the professional development needs of water resource managers. And we're going to frame that in terms of core competencies. Several years ago, there were a group of us from universities around the Great Lakes region that got together. Many of us have our own watershed academies or lake management academies, and we wanted to really determine if we were doing a good job of addressing the professional development needs of our clientele, our target audience. And one of the ways we thought to look at that was to identify core competencies that those individuals need in order to be good watershed leaders. And so we undertook a project to identify those needs. And I'm looking now for the, there it is, the arrow to advance the slide. Most of us, I think, when we first sit down to think about what a program for watershed leaders needs to include, we'll quickly brainstorm a very long list of areas of knowledge and skill that watershed leaders need to have. This slide just kind of is a representation of what that might look like if you just did a quick brainstorming session. There's no end to the areas of expertise, knowledge, awareness that an individual who's going to be participating in watershed leadership needs to have. So you really need kind of a systematic approach to figure out, okay, what exactly are we going to try to address in our educational program, and what can we leave behind? So when you're developing a curriculum for a watershed leadership program or academy, one of the first things you'll want to think about is what are those areas of knowledge and skill, in other words, core competencies that watershed leaders need. Once you've identified that, you can start to think about which areas do we need to cover and how should we cover those areas. And then finally, you're going to want to think about, okay, what's the best way to deliver that material? And what's the best way to achieve our learning objectives? Ann and I are going to start out talking about how we, as a team, identified those critical knowledge and skill areas. Real quick review of what are core competencies. So looking back at kind of the origin of this concept, I found this quote from the Council on Linkages Between Academia and Public Health Practice. So this is a team that was put together of academicians and public health practitioners from around the country, and they were charged with this idea of identifying core competencies. They identify them as foundational skills that professionals need who are practicing or engaged in education and research in public health. So if we modify this just a little bit for our purposes, I would say our core competencies are the foundational knowledge and skills. We decided to broaden ours to look at both knowledge and skills desirable for water resource professionals who are engaged in the practice of, in particular, watershed scale management. Our methods for identifying those core competencies, we started with the literature review and also a review of our existing curriculums. We all had methodologies for identifying what areas needed to be covered in our curriculum, so we felt that there was some validity to that process and identifying some core competencies, but we also wanted to check ourselves against the literature to see if we were perhaps missing some core competencies. So we conducted a review of both literature and curriculum, came up with a list of competencies, and then based on that list, we created a survey that we sent out to individuals who had participated in our watershed and lake management academies, and asked them to rate that list of competencies, which ones were most critical. The 3 training programs that were involved at the time that we did this survey were Michigan State's Lake and Stream Leaders Institute, Purdue's Indiana Watershed Leadership Program, and our Ohio Watershed Academy. The Minnesota Watershed Leadership Program did not exist at the time that we did this initial survey. Quick overview of the responses. We reached 445. We were able to identify 445 individuals who had participated in one of the academies. We got a 26% response rate. You can see the response rate by state over on the right. Indiana, clearly the overachievers there. 95% of those who responded had completed or graduated from the course that they were engaged in. On average, the individuals, the respondents had 8 years of experience as water resource professionals, and 80% were still working in water management in some capacity at the time that they completed the survey. Lots of different job titles of individuals who participated in our programs. This is just a sample, but it gives you a sense of the broad range of the types of individuals who participate in these programs. So we're not necessarily talking about the watershed leader, who we might often think of as the watershed coordinator. Oftentimes the leaders who participate in our programs are leading in some other capacity. Maybe they're a board member, or maybe they're participating on an advisory council. But it also presents a challenge in terms of curriculum development to meet the needs of individuals with such wide ranges of experiences. So that's one of the challenges that you face when you're developing a watershed education program. This is an example of what the survey questions looked like. We had 26 total knowledge and skill items that we identified from our literature and program curriculum review. We put those into 6 different categories. So this is just an example of one of those categories that would show up on the survey. This is the organizational knowledge and skill category. And then there were 3 items under that: strategic planning, facilitation, and fundraising. And we would ask the respondents to rate as not at all critical, all the way up to very critical for each of those items. So this is an example. Say this respondent indicated that strategic planning was very critical to watershed leadership. They thought that facilitation and fundraising were critical. So that's just an example of what the survey looked like. Obviously, there would have been 23 other items that each survey respondent would have rated. And then we also included at the end an open-ended question asking respondents to tell us what are the top 5 competencies that they think they use. And Anne's going to talk about that a little more in her portion of the talk. So these were the 6 competency areas that emerged from the literature review and the program curriculum review: organizational competencies, interpersonal, ecological assessment, implementation, policy, and education and outreach. So there were items under each of those 6 competency areas. So we took all the responses, and for all of the items that rated as critical or very critical, we concluded that those were core competencies. And this is the list of those core competencies, those rated as critical or very critical, and the category within which they fit. So you can see we had 4 under organizational. There were 6 items under policy, 2 under interpersonal, 2 under education and outreach, 2 under implementation, and 2 under ecological assessment. And then out of those, just maybe for your own interest, what were the top 5? You might want to just take a guess, and then here they are. Partnerships and collaboration was number 1. Outreach and communication number 2. Project management was number 3. The 4th highest rated was landowner interactions, and the 5th highest was understanding best management practices. So those were the top 5, but we rated all 18 of these items as being core competencies, as being critical or very critical. And so now Anne's going to talk a little bit more about the open-ended question.
Thank you, Joe. So in order to get a sense of what the practitioners felt were key competencies, not just of the ones that were hosted or addressed in their academies, we asked specifically, please identify the competencies that have proven to be the most beneficial to you and made the most difference in your water resource management role. They listed some of those. They talked about what ways in which they use them. I coded that data, the qualitative data, and looked at the codes for emergent themes. 5 theme areas emerge: effective communications, organizational and project management related skills, one I termed facilitative leadership, vision or maintaining a vision, and collaboration. These were very similar to the ones, of course, that came out in the quantitative rating of the 26 areas that Joe just talked about. The 2 that are different are that emerged were facilitative leadership and vision. I would like to demonstrate or illustrate now some ways in which people were using the competency areas. Having a little trouble advancing to the next slide, Janice. There we go. Okay, I think it was just a little bit of a delay. So how were the practitioners applying the competencies they talked about? These quotes are from the participants, and with communication, it's something that's happening each and every day, and it's so critical to be really nimble with this. You're tailoring a message. If you're not communicating about this as in your leadership position, people just simply aren't going to know about it. You're working on multiple ways of communicating, everything from presentations to a variety of social media to those one-on-one interactions. With organizational skills and project management, it's not only juggling and prioritizing it, but it's doing it in a very analytical way that you're showing progress as well as transparency in terms of what can actually be achieved given the resources that you have. So the organizational skills, when we asked participants how they were using, we really got a sense of the complexity and pressure that they're under in terms of those types of skills. In this category that emerged from the open-ended question about what competencies were critical in their experiences of vision was, to me, really interesting. I think what best sort of expresses it is you have to really keep your eye on the outcomes that you've established and hold that vision up, as well as get others' input into creating the vision. So you're both facilitating and sort of holding the candle up. So it was a more esoteric concept than maybe we addressed specifically in the academies, but that was a really nice one to start to illustrate in terms of what the practitioners felt really kind of was the tipping point to success. In terms of collaboration and partnerships, when they talked about how they apply those, really they were key to both implementation and just getting things done. No one entity or organization can do all the components, everything from engineering to outreach and communication, or just understanding and analyzing water quality data without keeping opening and strong, trusted relationships with multiple entities. Implementation just doesn't occur. And just quickly with facilitative leadership, again, that's a term that I coined from looking over the qualitative data. Some nice quotes to illustrate that. Of course, being able to let others have the idea, yet support and facilitate that. In summary, the emergent competencies for these professionals appear to be being able to maintain partnerships and collaborate, communicate and conduct effective outreach, manage projects, interact successfully with landowners, understand and be able to implement BMPs. Those were all categories of competencies covered in the academy. Emergent categories competencies that we found based on practitioners' experiences were being able to maintain a vision and be effective as a facilitative leader. I think the most interesting overarching theme to me for this study was how nimble these professionals have to become at integrating these competencies. And as creators of professional development, we can think about some really interesting, authentic learning experiences where we allow them to practice multiple skills from these areas and knowledge pieces. Thank you, Janice. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anne. And we'll move right on to our next speaker, Lois Wolfson. Lois is a Senior Outreach Specialist in Water Resources at the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife and the Institute of Water Research at Michigan State University. And Lois, I will advance. Oh, I'm sorry. Again, I'm used to having one person, not two, in each segment. So Jane Frankenberger is also going to be talking during this segment. She is a professor and extension specialist in agricultural and biological engineering at Purdue University and also directs the Indiana Watershed Leadership Academy. Go ahead, Lois and Jane.
All right, I will start. Thank you, Rebecca, and thanks everyone who has joined us as well. For this portion of the webinar, Jane and I are going to talk about these 4 different watershed leadership courses that were developed at 4 land-grant universities, and then our approaches to training. So you've all been introduced to the 4 courses through Joe's presentation from Ohio State, Michigan State, Purdue, and the University of Minnesota. The number in parentheses is actually the date that these programs were initiated. For this study, we were interested in reviewing the programs to look at the advantages and disadvantages of our delivery systems, the motivations that people had for participating in them, how each of the programs approached this type of training, and what we could learn from it to enhance our course in the future and new ones that may be developing. So for the delivery format, MSU's program is entirely face-to-face with 5 all-day sessions offered over the course of 6 months on a biennial basis. So in the alternate years, we have a 1-day face-to-face advanced class for alumni. At Purdue's Indiana Watershed program, it's a blended course. It consists of 3 face-to-face class sessions and a series of web-based distance learning modules offered over a 5-month period. Now both OSU's and University of Minnesota's programs are entirely online. The OSU program is a 10-week online course, and University of Minnesota's lasts 14 weeks with optional web and phone meetings. And in the next presentation, Anne will talk more about the benefits and challenges of these delivery methods and what were some of the advantages we found. The target audiences varied somewhat within each state, as Joe just mentioned in his presentation, but all of them attracted a wide variety and a diversity of participants. Many were directly involved in developing and implementing watershed management plans, but there were also people that represented local government, conservation districts, and many university students as well. And then at least 2 or more of the states had participants representing a variety of other professions, such as the extension educators and non-governmental organization representatives. And then some retirees also took part in the classes. Generally, the average number of participants ranged from 15 to 30 people. Now, one of the challenges, and again, Joe mentioned that a little bit, that we encountered was working with this wide variety of participants with respect to their previous experience and also their varied interest in the topics covered. So to address this, in Michigan, we provided a list of prerequisites that would help potential participants prepare to take the course. In Minnesota, they did hold those optional weekly meetings to answer questions from participants. And also we found it, as we gave lists of references and basic information, we found that was a really good option for those who needed to brush up on some of the basic concepts. So why were participants motivated to take the course? In our evaluations, and in some cases even the pre-application, we found that many students took it for professional development and some type of certification, either professional certification or at least getting a certificate of completion. They were also interested in improving their skills, particularly in leadership, and also increasing their knowledge in watershed management and lake and stream ecology. Many said it gave them the opportunity to network with other people doing similar types of activities and learning what others are doing in their watershed. In Ohio, it's required for watershed coordinators who may have received funding from the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. They must take the course. And both in Minnesota and Ohio, they offered the course for university credit, which may motivate students to take this type of course. So how did we address the core competencies? All but one of the courses were developed prior to the survey that Joe and Ann talked about. But after we looked at the survey results, we saw that our topics coincided very well with our survey results. In the early stages of developing these courses, each state started by assembling an advisory committee made up of university people and state agency representatives to help guide development of the curriculum. Indiana and Ohio did a needs assessment survey, and as previously mentioned, Ohio also did a curriculum review and a literature search. For all 4 states, it was determined that the course should include a social science aspect, a natural science aspect, or components, and also technical skills. So listed in bold are the major topic areas that all 4 of our courses included: the leadership, education, communication, technology and tools, natural science, policy regulations, and planning. And then underneath are bulleted items, which are examples of some of the specific topics, but not all of the state courses addressed all of these items. But all 4 states did place a focus on developing watershed management plans. So I'm going to turn over the mic to Jane, and she's going to go ahead and discuss a few other features of our programs, how the courses were evaluated, some of the lessons we learned from looking at these 4 courses, and then conclusions that we reached after comparing them.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. This is Jane Frankenberger, and I want to start by saying we think that one thing that makes these programs particularly effective is the required learning activities. I've called them individual here just to emphasize that participants don't just show up for a meeting and listen, but that they need to do something themselves. And this might include required readings, discussion with peers, and in some of the programs that's online and some in face-to-face. And then they need to do a specific activity that can help them become better watershed leaders. Among the 4 programs, there are many more examples than this. I've just picked out a few. In Indiana alone, we have 6 required and about 20 available elective modules, from which people choose 3. But you can just see them here, a few of them here. So I want to emphasize again that all the learning modules ask participants to complete activities that are useful to them in watershed management, and at least in 2 of our states we also require a larger group or individual project. And to benefit from these individual learning activities, people have to actually do them, and we all know that in life sometimes we have the best intentions to complete something that would be useful to us, but life gets in the way. And we find that the fact that we're reviewing assignments and providing feedback adds a level of accountability that's not there in a lot of other extension programs. None of our programs actually grade submissions, but there's an assessment of whether the assignment is complete, and at the end of the program, students or participants receive a certificate if they've completed the minimum number. So I think of it as especially accountability. And in turn, the participants provide feedback of our programs, to our programs. So we've listed some of the ways feedback is provided in the table. I think you can see that all the programs offer multiple opportunities for feedback, both on the individual modules and on the program as a whole. And this great evaluation that we've received from some people who are on this webinar, I believe, has helped, has provided formative evaluations that have improved our programs through the years, and also provided impact assessments that we need for funding agencies and our extension programs. And in the last few years, we've been writing an article, and I'll discuss that in just a minute, or I'll mention that. Funding sources have included our universities, the student fees, and this varies. Our Indiana program actually does include 2 overnights that I didn't write there and has now gone up to $700, especially 319 grants where EPA funding is provided through the state sources, and then various other grants. And on this slide, we want to thank some of the specific people and programs that have contributed to to our programs and made it much richer, including the instructors who provide in-kind presentations. And I'm going to conclude with a couple slides. There's so much more we can say, but I wanted to close by drawing together a few things that we came up with as we wrote an article in the Journal of Contemporary Water Resources and Education. I'll put that up in a minute. But what we realized is that our programs all integrate a wide variety of topics and tools because our goal is to build the capacity for integrated watershed management. And as the first bullet states, strong watershed management coordinators have to have an ability to integrate the natural science tools and information with social skills to inform water resource management. So we have the challenging task in these programs of building the capacity of watershed coordinators to act as a bridge between technical experts and the people who can get things done in the watershed. This includes, for example, an ability to determine what information people might need and to figure out how to translate the natural science into terms that decision makers can understand. And we know that part of what is needed, at least, is really a set of qualities like curiosity, confidence, credibility, etc. And these qualities are not easily taught, but really are the desired outcome of the integrated watershed programs that we have put together. Anything else? So I would just say in conclusion that an insight that came from pulling all these programs together is that our integrated training programs are really kind of like an integrated watershed management plan or program. Just like watershed coordinators or leaders have to pull complex water resources and human dimensions together, our watershed capacity building programs focus on helping watershed coordinators understand the complexity of water resources and how the pieces fit together. Thanks. So that's my end. I'll pass it back to you, Rebecca.
And thank you, Lois. Okay, and we'll move right on to Ann Lewandowski, researcher at the University of Minnesota Water Resources Center and also a great educator, I might add. She directs the Minnesota Water Specialist Training Program. And go ahead, Ann.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. Let's see here. I'm going to skip this first slide, which Jane covered so well in describing who it is we're training here, in that we're talking about integrating a lot of competencies. We're not trying to train on a collection of skills, but it's that integration which is really important. So for people who are considering developing training programs for watershed professionals, there's 3 things to think about. 1 is the topics you're going to talk about. 2 are the principles of adult learning, and 3rd are these principles of distance learning. Regarding the training topics, and this isn't just about the list of competencies that Ann and Joe talked about, but the step further of what actually needs to be trained, where are the weaknesses, where can training make the most impact. Every state, every region, whatever, has their own needs, and so it's pretty important to take some time with the right people around the table to think through and define the learning objectives. Regarding adult learning, there's a whole big literature on this and a lot of important principles, but the big one is probably to stay relevant, keeping the learning relevant to the adult learners. They have specific goals they're trying to meet. They need it to be hands-on, they need it to be flexible and relevant to the work they're doing. And then the other piece is this diversity, which you've heard about several times today. We have people from every different educational background. We have people working in large metropolitan area offices. We have people coming from one-person rural offices, people working in forested areas, agricultural, urban, and a diversity of learning skills. And to try to make a program that's flexible enough to meet all those needs takes some thought and intention. And then regarding principles of distance learning, the isolation of that is an issue to be considered. I'll talk more about that in the coming slides. When you're talking about online versus face-to-face, it's not useful to ask the question, is online or face-to-face more effective? They're both effective. The question is how to make each mode effective. Both have their advantages. Distance education saves travel time. It allows the learner to control their learning process. Face-to-face, on the other hand, provides more interpersonal connection to the instructors and with other learners. And it also provides more guidance in the learning process, which is the flip side of letting learners control their learning. Either those may be an advantage depending who you're working with. In each of these cases, you ask the questions, what should be taught, who should be taking it, and who should be teaching it? And the answers are a little different in all of these cases. Regarding who should take it, basically online learning is more appropriate for self-directed learners who have a specific career path in mind. It really doesn't work as well for beginning students that don't necessarily have the learning skills. Online is suitable for the tech savvy. It's suitable for professionals because they generally have access to the technology that's needed and they're self-directed learners. It's not as suitable for field-based professionals. People who are outside all the time have a harder time getting to a computer to deal with some of the needs for distance learning. Generally, these attributes fit Watershed professionals, so this can fit pretty well. Then there's the question of what's the right content, what should be taught. And this isn't an issue of what topics to teach, but rather what learning objectives. And for example, if you ask the question about the index of biotic integrity, is that an appropriate topic for online learning? Well, if the learning objective is for the students to be able to define the IBI and what the components are, then yes, that can certainly be taught online. If the learning objective is for them to be able to collect the data, then no, that needs to happen in a river with people actually out in the field doing this. So then the question is, how should it be taught? And what are some of the appropriate learning activities? And they're different for the face-to-face to the distance things. And the big one that I like to emphasize is reflection. And this is the big strength of face-to-face settings. In distance learning or a face-to-face setting, it's easy to present material. People can watch videos, they can read, and so on. And then it also works, it's easy for people to apply the material that they learn. They can do exercises and assignments on their own and start thinking through this material. But then in the learning process, it's really valuable to follow up that application with reflection, to have everybody back in the same room talking about what they did, talking about the case study, and giving some feedback and reflection. And that really works best in a face-to-face setting. Other things that work well in face-to-face are role-playing, group problem solving, field-based skills, obviously, and the networking. In a distance setting, again, presentations, that works great. Discussions work really well because it gives people time for thoughtful participation. They can take the time to write and work at their own pace and compose their thoughts. That works pretty well. The other thing that works at a distance very well is giving people a choice of modules and learning activities to work on. And this is really important in this Watershed professional setting, because we can give people a choice of different kinds of activities, and they can choose the level of involvement that they want or that they need given what they're working on. So that's pretty valuable. They can apply it to their own situation. I think Jane mentioned in Indiana they have this exercise where they have people drive around their watershed doing their exploring their watershed and getting information. So they can do that on their own in their own situation. So that works well. You can provide online tools and resources, and you can do networking. Now you notice I have networking on both of these lists, and I want to say a little more about that because networking is so important to professional audiences, especially in a complex field like water resource management. And the training programs can really help build networks. Well, it does two things. You can actually build networks by having people meet other people in the field, but it also can help them build networking skills, and both of those are really important. The networking that happens online has the one advantage of you can have more types of people in the room. You can draw from a geographically more diverse area, and so that's one advantage. Of course, face-to-face is invaluable in making connections to people, and so sometimes what we find is real useful is thinking in terms of online as supporting the face-to-face networking. A lot of these professionals have other events going on, other training, other conferences, and so on, where they can do the face-to-face. And if you can think about your online activities as sort of feeding into those, that helps. It's important to differentiate networking from socializing. Socializing is really difficult to do online. Networking you can kind of get away with. Socializing is really difficult. And for that reason, online training is a little less suited to volunteers who are really strongly motivated by the desire for socializing. The fact is, face-to-face is just more fun. And so where that's important, then face-to-face is really what you need to be doing. When some of the challenges of distance learning, the problem is not the distance. The problem is that it's asynchronous. And so people feel it can become isolated or lacking in motivation. And there's a number of techniques we use to address this. And probably the biggest, most important one is explicitly talk about these challenges at the beginning and encourage participants to plan for that. To address low motivation, we really promote accountability in a number of ways. We provide regular assignments and checkpoints. This is not a class where you are given a bunch of readings and say, come back in 3 months with your assignment completed. Instead, we have regular deadlines, probably 2 a week, maybe, for them to participate. And then peer feedback is really important. If people have to submit an assignment that their classmates are going to take a look at and comment on, or if they're participating in a discussion. That kind of accountability really keeps them on task. And then finally, there's a number of ways to address the isolation, to promote social interaction. We give people time in the first week to practice interacting online, to get used to this unusual way of interacting with people. We record weekly videos where one of the instructors will talk about what happened last week and what's coming up this week, so they have that sort of live comments. We require these discussion sections which are asynchronous, but still there is this interaction. And then we offer this option for synchronous sessions, so people can talk to each other on the phone during webinar settings. And then there are ways to try and build networks, adding a face-to-face component like some of the programs have, involving alumni in the teaching so people meet more of the Watershed folks around the state, mentoring, developing an online community, alumni gatherings. There are ways to do this. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Anne. Okay, great presentations by our presenters, and now it is time for questions. So please, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them in the chat box at the lower left-hand portion of your screen. And I'll give people a minute to go ahead and do that. Not a whole minute, just a few seconds or so. And if we don't have any from our audience, I have a couple questions that I have for the presenters. Okay, not seeing any questions immediately appearing in the chat box. So one question that I had, you all have in your own way talked about the need for participants in these watershed education programs to be able to integrate across a diversity of skills. Can you give us some examples of the types of exercises or assignments that you give to folks that helps them integrate those skills?
This is Jane, and that's a great question. So I've been thinking about it since you posted it a few minutes ago and kind of reviewed all our individual learning modules. This is in Indiana, and I actually don't find any that I would truly call, integrating across natural and social sciences. All of them are mainly in one or the other, and so maybe that suggests some opportunities. What I would say is that the final thing that our participants do is a group project, and that would be where we would hope that everyone achieves that integration as they look in depth at a particular issue, maybe developing something and thinking about how it could be used. But it's a great question, and I think we've mainly think that the program is integrated, but the individual activities aren't. But I think there's opportunities there.
Yeah, I'll agree with Jane on the part that we also have our participants do a project in their community, and they then present it, and in their presentations we can see that they've incorporated many of the core competencies that are needed. So for example, there was someone who was doing a tree root demonstration project, and he was talking about how he had to get the people involved, but also the scientific aspects of the project in terms of where to put this, the engineering involved with it, accessing priority areas, where would be the best place along the stream, and then also possible tools that they might use, permits that they might use. So all of this we see when our students and participants present their projects and presentations at the end of the course.
Yeah, this is Anne. We have an exercise where they have to write a work plan at the end, where they have to integrate all the different skills they've been learning. During the Watershed Science module, we ask them to explain, pick one of the fundamental science topics, and we have some choices for them. But they have to explain it to a particular audience, and they have to pick, you know, are they talking to a county commissioner, or are they talking to a local or landowner, or whatever it might be. So they have to word their audience that way, or word their response that way.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm going to go to Dave DeGeis's question next. Why is changing farmer behavior not listed as a priority for watershed managers? Shouldn't there be an emphasis on selling practices?
You know, Rebecca, I could probably speak to that. I think that did get addressed, but perhaps not in the exact format that Dave put his question. But I think if you go back to some of the competencies that rose to the top, so outreach, communication, interpersonal skills, I think actually with landowners was one of the top 5 ranked categories. So, and some of the examples in terms of how that is implemented was clearly almost exactly what Dave's suggesting. So not only do you have to communicate about water quality standards, but you have to form a relationship that actually gets people interested in a program or project that relates to improving the water. So I think his example is great, and it definitely came up in terms of what people said they needed to do and how they applied these areas.
Yeah, this is Joe. I'll just kind of reiterate what Ann says and build on a little bit that several of our modules in the Ohio Watershed Academy address essentially what Dave is talking about. For example, in education outreach, we talk about you've got to identify your target audience, you've got to determine what are the barriers to adoption, and you've got to, in your outreach and education programs, you need to directly address those barriers. And then also, when we do talk about best management practices, although this is a new module that we're going to be adding to the Academy, we'll be talking about not just what are the practices available, but how do you achieve adoption of those practices. So it does show up, I think, in several different modules.
Yeah, this is Ann. Our civic engagement module is really quite popular among the participants, and we get into that.
Great. And I think, Joe, you started leading into Monica's question a little bit. Does your team have any plans for implementation of your findings?
Yeah, I have been working on revising our Ohio Watershed Academy curriculum for the last several months, based almost entirely on the research that we've been engaged in across the region into these core competencies and looking at what are the skills and knowledge needs of watershed leaders around the region. So yeah, I'm adding quite a few modules, revising others, but it did give me a good excuse and a lot of good information to take a closer look and reevaluate my existing curriculum and rethink it and try to do a better job of addressing the different categories of competencies more evenly.
Okay, and our next question is from Mike Eel of 4 states with leadership training programs. Do any or all allow participation from folks in other states? And Mike is from North Dakota, so anyone can take that.
I'll take that. This is Ann in Minnesota, and we would love to have somebody from North Dakota. This last semester we had somebody from Alaska participating, and it added an interesting color and perspective to the discussions, and just made people think about, yeah, a different way of looking at water issues and different kinds of constraints. So it seemed to work quite well.
This is Jane, and our Indiana program in the past has been more reliant on 319 funding, and so we were particularly concerned about meeting Indiana's needs. But now we don't have that funding, and I really would welcome people from any states. We have 3 face-to-face meetings, so North Dakota might be kind of a challenge for you to participate, but if anybody from a neighboring state is interested, I think that would be great. In the past, we've had some federal agency people from Chicago.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Lois.
I was just going to say, being that we're all face-to-face, it might be challenging for a neighboring state to come and be in on all of our sessions, but we certainly would welcome it if somebody was interested in doing that.
Yeah, and in Ohio, since we went fully online, we have had a few people from out of state, and they are very welcome. I'm going to be going back to a format where we do include some face-to-face meetings, so I'm going to have to think about whether someone could participate and get a certificate of completion without participating in the face-to-face meetings, but we certainly have done that in the past.
Anyway, great question, Mike.
Yeah. We just have a couple minutes left, so people can again continue to submit questions in the chat box. I have another question, and that is related to incorporating new information in a different way. So, for example, as watershed-related research on the natural science side, becomes available, or on the social science side, how do you do updates? When do you do updates? How do you decide when to incorporate new science, whether on the natural science side or the social science side in your curriculum?
This is Jane. For the ones that I've developed, which is several of the tools related, and of course I just update whenever I have a new idea, so that's very informal. Some of the other ones that have been around for longer, we formally had sort of a check, an evaluation, that's not quite the right word, but check to see if they're still up to date. We've gotten a team of people together, but probably on the social science should go back to the social scientists directly and ask for updates based on new information, because that's certainly critical.
We don't have any canned presentations. We depend heavily on guest speakers coming in and talking to us and our participants on emerging issues, the latest information on a particular topic area, perhaps legal issues and riparian rights. So we sort of depend on our lecturers to be up to date and present the most current information that they have.
Yeah, this is Ann. I would say that's for us too, the webinars and the weekly webinar teleconferences. Those are a chance that we can be responsive to the current information. And then last year we had a number of people from tribal government that were participating. And so for our policy webinar, we brought in somebody from one of the tribes to talk about their policy issues, the context that they work in. And then after that we incorporated some of that information into the regular materials.
Yeah, and in Ohio we have offered webinars during the Watershed Academy. They weren't required, but if a participant did participate in a webinar, they could get credit for an assignment for participating in that, and that also for us was a way that we could provide a little more contemporary subjects without having to change a module.
Great. Okay. Any other questions from participants? Okay, well, let's thank Ann and Joe and Lois and Jane and Ann very much for your great presentations. And thank you, everybody out there, for joining us. We have so if you know people that might be interested in this topic and weren't able to attend, please feel free to pass the information on. You can find the webinars at northcentralwater.org. Our upcoming sessions for June, extension programs for youth, environmental and science, technology, engineering, and math education. In July, green infrastructure for watershed water resource management, and then in August we're going to be talking about groundwater resources. So thanks everyone. Happy spring and early summer, and appreciate you joining us. Have a great day.